present our joint work that we did during the last year. And let's see in the agenda points that we will have for today. So the webinar itself, let's say, will be split in general into 3 parts. We will have an opening statements from Director of DG of Energy, some statements from ENTSO-E, T&D Europe, WindEurope representatives, and then we will dive into particular discussions about the Workstream with general overview of it, and we'll pass from Workstream 1 to Workstream 4, 5. This may not tell you at the moment a lot, but I hope after all the presentations you will have deep knowledge about proposal of the research activities. Then we will have short break for the coffee, and after the break we will be open for panel discussion with representatives from DG Energy, from T&D Europe and ENTSO-E WindEurope, in order to discuss with you openly all the questions you might have, and at the end we will close the meeting. I would not like to stop too long here, but as we are a big audience at the moment, if we go to the next slide, we would like to introduce a little bit ground rules for this webinar. So we ask everyone to be muted during the meeting, and also please turn off your cameras. Please also smile because you are. Please also note that all the webinar is in recording, and the cameras will be on only from the presenters who are speaking at the moment. Also, for all the questions, if you have during the webinar and panel discussions, you are more than free to chat and write in the Teams directly in the chat. And together with Vasiliki, we will do the best to raise your question up and to ask them to the panelists. And in general, that's it. The main things are told. So let's enjoy the webinar. And I would like to invite to make a statement from DG Energy, from Katerina Sikov-Mani, Director of DG Energy. Welcome.
Many thanks, both of you, for the welcome, and very pleased to be here today to discuss a very important issue in the EU policy, which is how to bring offshore renewable energy onshore and to consumers. As committed in the European Green Deal, our energy system will have to largely rely on renewable energy by 2050. Already by 2030, we estimate that we need to have at least 38 to 40% share of renewables to meet the 55% greenhouse gas reduction target that our heads of state and government agreed on last December. When we look at offshore, the EU is very rich. We have the longest sea coast probably in the world and massive potential for offshore energy. It's not only in the North Sea or Baltic Sea, but also in the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. And this is why our strategy that we adopted last November has set a target to bring at least 60 gigawatt of offshore wind by 2030 and 300 gigawatts by 2050. Compared to today, we are speaking about a 30-fold increase. The question, of course, then is the EU equipped to achieving this ambitious objective? The short answer is yes. The EU today is a global leader in offshore wind and new technologies in supporting that. And the growth of the installed capacity and the cost reductions achieved over the last years have been impressive, not only in offshore wind, but in all renewable production technologies. And this is a very good starting point for us. But business as usual will not get us to the 300 gigawatt I mentioned. For that, we need a genuine step change. We may even call it a paradigm shift in policy, in the way we cooperate, in technology, and in investments. And this is exactly what the offshore strategy aims at doing. It aims at bringing the players together across the sea areas and the territories where electricity is then consumed. And this cooperation range from preparing together for investments in transmission, in ports, in maritime spatial planning, and also to upskilling the workforce. And last but not least, research and innovation. To address the many challenges that we have seen, the Commission will establish later this year a dedicated offshore working group within the Clean Energy Industrial Forum on renewables. It will be dedicated specifically to the needs and challenges of the offshore renewable sector and the technology development. Innovation in the sector must continue, also when it comes to technologies that are currently in the prototype or demonstration phase. The EU will support this through the first work program of Horizon Europe that is being adopted as we speak. High voltage direct current with ad hoc control strategies such as grid forming capabilities integrated within the present alternating current grid is a key step forward. It will enable the transmission of high amounts of energy over very long distances, the integration of up to theoretically 100% of offshore and onshore renewables, as well as an increased resilience of the grid, so as to make all offshore and onshore grid fit for purpose in 2050. This offers a huge potential to our citizens and businesses, for industry, and allows EU to continue to keep its technological leadership. So today's event is a key area to further push for this technological development, which is essential for allowing us to meet our targets. Many thanks for your attention.
Many thanks, Katarina, to you for sharing with us these thoughts and these important messages, and for the support of the European Commission during all these all these months that we have been preparing this work. I would like to pass the word now to Håkon Borken, ENTSO-E Chair of the Research Development and Innovation Committee. Welcome, Håkon.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a huge challenge we do have now in order to integrate a huge quantity of the wind energy to the consumption centers. It's a very important task for the TSOs. How to do that? Knowing that the scale of the wind production, as was just presented, will be more than 60 gigawatts. And if you include UK and Norway, it's more than that, and maybe 80 gigawatts. The fact that we have to use DC at the highest voltage tells us that this is a complete new task for us. Because normally when we connect DC, it's a kind of an end-to-end channel from A to B, like we did in Norway. Now we have launched the cable together with TenneT to Germany, and to the UK we started up last week with the North Sea Link. It's a complete locked-in technology. You are very dependent on the vendors, and what we need in the future is a grid of DC offshore, which can be used in a way that you are independent of the manufacturers, that you can choose different manufacturers. And then we need interoperability. And that's a huge task, and it can only be done together with industry. So the TSOs, the wind industry, and of course the manufacturers do have to work together in order to solve this. And that's why we're here also today to talk about that, because that is the challenge is big, but it's only possible to solve together. And ENTSO-E, if you just take the map, we are working on, of course, the whole rollout of this, and that includes the TYNDP, and the task for the TSOs is, of course, to deliver on the goals on the 60 gigawatt of offshore, the 300 gigawatt in 2050, and it will be only possible if we make this in an interoperable way. So that's the key of my introduction today, and I look forward for this very important conference. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Håkon. I would like now to welcome Jochen Kreusel, Deputy President of T&D Europe. Good afternoon, Jochen.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, Vasiliki and all the others. And thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I have the pleasure to represent the European manufacturers of equipment for power networks called T&D Europe. And as Katharina has indicated already, Europe has always been leading in these technologies that we will require, and is also really the place where most inventions in the T&D space have made in the past. So on one side, we are proud on that, of course. We are also confident that we will be able jointly with the entire ecosystem. Of course, it's not only us or not only the network operators and also not only the academia, it's all of us together, having always worked closely together and brought us to this position. And we are very confident that we will be able to extrapolate that success story from the past as an important contributor to achieving the European goals on one side, on the other side also to contribute to a strong European industry. Håkon has already pointed out what will become different in future with regard to HVDC, which used to be a special solution for special challenges, usually built as point-to-point single vendor projects, and we will now come more to a grid approach where we have to build one node after the other. They will have to interoperate across vendors and also among more than two of them, what was the standard case in the past. And well, the traditional approach to solve such issues is not the first time in the history of the ecosystem to address that. Would be go through standardization, which will play an important role. There is no doubt, and there are also standardization activities going on while we are talking here. Then go through pilots and first small ones, and then when you're sure that it works, go to real deployment, which in the case of what we are talking about here means really big projects. Well, here comes urgency in, and Katharina also mentioned the need for a paradigm shift in R&D, a different approach. I think we need to be faster this time, and therefore we are striving to achieve this real project demonstrating what we means all of us together, the ones being represented in today's webinar, much earlier and faster with new approaches and a new framework. And that's why we are so cooperating so closely, and we're also very grateful that we get very good guidance and support from the Commission here. And therefore, we see this webinar also as one more building block in this new approach, which I dare to say was a success story so far, and I'm confident that it will continue to be a success story. And again, we are very grateful to be part of that, and also to be here today together with you. Looking forward to an interesting afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jochen. Thank you for sharing these thoughts with us. And I would like now to invite Giles Dixon, CEO of WindEurope, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Vasiliki. So the EU wants 60 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. When you actually go through the commitments that the 27 member states have made on offshore wind in their national energy and climate plans, and since they finalized those plans, you actually get to a number that is slightly higher than 60 gigawatts. You then add to that the 40 gigawatts that the UK are determined to build by 2030, and the new numbers recently announced by the Norwegian government. And WindEurope is of the view that we're looking at 110 gigawatts of offshore wind in Europe by 2030, provided that we can make the necessary investments in the grid. Today we have only 25 gigawatts of offshore wind across the whole of Europe, and all of those wind farms are operating on a simple old-fashioned point-to-point grid connection basis. There is one which is now being developed, Kriegers Flak, which will have grid connections both to Germany and to Denmark. And it will be the first of its kind. It will be the first of these so-called hybrid offshore wind farms, which will play an increasingly important role in offshore wind. HVDC technology is going to be a good thing for all grid connections to offshore wind farms because it will help to optimize the grid. It will make the grid more resilient, as Katarina said, and it will give offshore wind that grid forming capability that we want it to have. HVDC will be particularly important, and the interoperability between different vendors, HVDC platforms, will be particularly important for these hybrid offshore wind farms that have grid connections to 2 or more countries. And they will be particularly important for those hybrid projects because it is very likely that the 3 different vendors, HVDC platforms, will be coexisting and needing to cooperate with one another. Therefore, they will need to be interoperable in the settings where we have these very large and quite complex grid systems around these hybrid offshore wind farms. Now, there's only one hybrid offshore wind farm so far today, but governments, TSOs, offshore wind farm developers are very keen that there should be many more. Hybrid offshore wind farms are, by definition, a good thing. They allow for the pooling of both transmission and generation assets. They therefore save money. They also save space, both in the sea and also on land, because they will allow us to have fewer landing points along our coastlines. One common type of hybrid offshore wind farm or cluster that we expect to develop is the so-called hub and spoke approach, where perhaps you have an artificial island or platform, or in some cases even a natural island, which is the hub, and you have offshore wind farms located close to that platform or island with AC connections into the island, and then a very large DC connection from that hub to the mainland and maybe to other mainlands as well in other countries. So they allow us to save space. They mean fewer landing points. They allow us to save money. And crucially, of course, the hybrid offshore wind farms, by creating connections to 2 or more countries, will act as de facto interconnectors and will help us improve energy flows between different countries. The wind industry believes that out of the 300 gigawatts of offshore wind that the EU aspires to have in 2050, around 1/3 could and should be hybrid offshore wind farms. That would be 100 gigawatts out of 300. And so it's really important that we can progress on the interoperability of the different HVDC systems. And so the collaboration between T&D Europe, ENTSO-E and WindEurope, with the active support of the European Commission, which we're discussing today, is extremely important. And as the wind industry, we're very grateful for the excellent collaboration that we're enjoying, both from our partners, T&D Europe and ENTSO-E, and also from the European Commission. And we look forward to discussing the detail today. Thank you.
Vasiliki, you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I was saying Giles, and I would like to ask everyone to please mute yourselves because we still hear some background noise. I would like to thank once again Katarina, Hakon, Jochen, and Giles for their active support and engagement and support during all this period. And let's deep dive now to the next part of our webinar, the most technical part. Over to you, Paulius.
So thank you again to all the speakers so far. Indeed, now we will enter to the technical details, and this is where most of the contents you will get. But as Giles and other speakers very well underlined, interoperability and hybrid HVDC systems are now of highest importance. So I invite Norela Constantinescu, Head of Innovation Section at ENTSO-E, to give us a general overview.
Thank you, Paulius, for passing the floor to me. Of course, I will not enter into the details of all the technical work which TSOs through ENTSO-E, T&D Europe and WindEurope have done, but I am pleased actually to mention this common effort which we carried out together for more than 1 year now, including with a lot of experts in the three associations. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. You have heard the political ambition which was mentioned by Katarina. You have also heard from Hakon, from Giles and from Johan, actually the work which we started to do. Of course, it's driven by the political development. It was based also on the outcomes of the previous projects which we carried out to a certain extent also commonly with the vendors and also with the wind developers, sometimes TSOs. And I would like to mention best path, promotion and migrate, which indicated us where our research and innovation activities should focus in the future in order to pave the way towards these 60 gigawatt, which has to be integrated by 2030. And of course, what we would like to achieve there, it's actually the research direction and innovation direction to cope with the technical challenges of this offshore wind capacity, integration into the network, and also, I think Katarina mentioned connection to the onshore grids. And here the key point which we identified was the interoperability. If we go to the next slide, we will need to change actually or to move from the present concept, which was mentioned before, the radial connection, to more the hybrid projects and I think and multi-terminal projects. And I think Giles was mentioning Krieger's Flag, one of the projects which was launched some time ago. I think it was coming with the recovery package after the 2008 crisis, and which is now finalized. Of course, we will need these multi-terminal solutions and also multi-vendor solutions in order to have this cope with the vendor interoperability, but also technical interoperability in terms of standardized functional requirements for HVDC converters, the switching stations, and also for the standardized interfaces in order to ensure the interoperability with the networks. And the focus is, of course, on the real industrial scale HVDC multi-terminal, multi-vendor developments, which can take place offshore. And this is something which we push for, including in our research and innovation actions we promote in ENTSO-E, but can be used further on in the same way in a broader context for future power grids with multi-vendor power electronic interface devices. And I would like to close.
Lorena, sorry, could you unmute yourself? I just had to mute everybody because I could not find a speaking participant.
Sorry. Sorry, thank you. So, and I would like to close by moving to the last slide. and saying that actually what we have carried out, it's trying to identify the challenges based on the previous projects and based on the previous developments and find the solutions. And this resulted in this work plan, which is going to guide us for the next 5, 6, 7 years to reach this multi-vendor, multi-terminal HVDC system. These challenges should be solved, so system stability with high penetration of power electronics interface devices, the interoperability of converters, which are provided by different vendors working together with the different parts of the transmission system in terms of the technical and manufacturer interoperability, as well as this concentration of AC/DC converters which are installed increasingly densely and which can have adverse control interactions. And therefore, the 5 work streams you see on the slide, they are interlinked, and the milestones are building up on each other in order to develop the multi-terminal, multi-vendor industrial scale project. The speakers afterwards, they will enter into the detail of each work stream. So first of all, development of standardized interaction study processes and interfaces. The work stream number 2, which is focusing on assessment of interoperability of multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC systems. And of course, this in line with the framework, the governance and the cooperation which needs to be put in place. And in order to achieve the real scale demonstrator, of course, we need to introduce this into the network planning and financing and procurement requirements. So once again, this is the cooperation of the 3 associations with the support and with the active involvement of their members. And I would like to thank all of us and all of those experts who contributed to this development of the workstream, and pass back to Paulus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Narella, very much for the introduction. So I invite all the audience to remember this initial figure that Narella showed with all the work streams interlinked in between themselves and fitting as a main input for multi-vendor, multi-terminal demonstrator. And now we will go workstream by workstream to see the details of each others, but please keep in mind that they are very strongly interlinked. And for the workstream 1, I invite Oliver Despoy, R&D project manager of HVDC and power electronics at RTE. Please, Oliver, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Paulus. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to introduce this workstream number 1 dedicated to development of standardized interaction study processes and interfaces. So if you could move to the next slide, please. Right. The objective of this workstream is first to develop a standard software model interface for the assessment of interactions and interoperability studies, but also the full definition and process for this interactions study framework, which should be relevant both on the DC side, but also on the AC side of the converters. I think it's important to highlight that this framework is intended for both real-time simulation, but also offline simulation. And the workstream 1 will focus on the development and the testing of this standardized interface for models and control replicas, but also the whole process for the interaction study. It includes some requirements for the inputs and outputs from the different stakeholders, mainly the TSOs and the manufacturers, but also other type of stakeholders which could be involved in this type of interaction studies. The expected benefits from workstream 1 are first to facilitate the practical implementation of interaction and interoperability studies for all the stakeholders including TSOs, of course. The way to enhance this implementation of interoperability studies is through both a reduction of cost for both studies, but also a reduction of time for the assessment of the interoperability. If you could move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Workstream 1 decomposes into 3 tasks. The first one is intended to highlight and define the whole process for the interaction and interoperability studies, but also define the model requirements for the EMT models and real-time simulation. Also, those requirements are expected for the simulation platform, whether it is offline or real-time simulation. In the end, we expect to have a standardized interface for the models and the equipment, but also provide functional specifications with a certain level of standardization, and also relevant for offline and real-time simulation. Next slide, please. Once this has been defined, the next task is intended to perform a dry run of the whole process, and in order to ensure that the different elements that we have specified and the requirements that are expected for the models and for the real-time simulation equipment and platform setup work correctly as expected. So this dry run is intended to assess the capability of the equipment and models to perform real interactions and interoperability studies relevant both on the AC and DC side. And with that, we expect to have a full verification of the methodology and possibly or most likely to further refine the requirements that have been defined in the previous task. Next slide, please. Finally, the last task is expected to extend the work that will have been covered for offshore DC grid connection in order to ensure that it's also relevant for any virtually any power electronic interface device, which could be, for example, onshore. And with this task, we expect to provide recommendations for the grid codes and also regarding software model interfacing for the community. So this is the main outcome of this task. And with that, I think we have a very wide view of Workstream 1. So I leave the floor to my colleague for Workstream 2. Thank you.
Thank you, Oliver. And we are inviting Mario Nedrek from HVDC System and Connection Network Codes Engineer from TenneT to introduce Workstream 2.
Thank you, Paulius. Thank you very much, first of all, for giving me the opportunity to present Workstream 2. So Workstream 2 is also heavily interacting with Workstream 1, already presented by Olivier, and it's focusing mainly on the assessment of interoperability in multi-vendor HVDC systems. Next slide, please. So Workstream 2 has been developed with a task, or let's say with objectives to address and to develop, to establish basic functional requirements for multi-terminal DC grids under multi-vendor environment, of course. So the main focus in the beginning of this workstream is to develop functional requirements at the DC connection points, but moreover to go also on the AC side and to investigate the benefit of grid forming capabilities. So as already discussed in the beginning of the session today, grid forming capabilities are important for the future stable and robust operation of the system. So in that frame, this workstream would elaborate on the functional requirements for grid forming converters for HVDC systems on the boundary conditions of interoperability. So as I mentioned, functional requirements, of course, on the DC side, because we are talking about DC grids here under multi-vendor environment, but also on the AC side, focusing on grid forming capabilities for HVDC stations at the offshore side, but also at the onshore side. Moreover, the objective of this workstream is mainly focusing on doing the interaction studies. So we already heard a lot interoperability, and we need to do interaction studies. And we need to do these interaction studies for specific pilot project and for specific real-time demonstration, real-time project that will be explained later on Workstream 3. So the objective of this task, of this workstream, is not only to develop functional requirements, but on the other side, to perform the interaction studies and at the end to come up with a decision, go no go, let's say, decision for going to the final real project implementation in the field. Last but not least, we should not forget that the interaction studies that will be performed or need to be performed in this workstream should be executed with the standard control and protection interface developed in Workstream 1, but also with the standard platforms as well. So in order to reach these objectives, this workstream, and you can read on the document, is split in 4 tasks. Next slide, please. As already mentioned, the first task, task A, is focusing on functional requirements with strong focus on the DC side. So it looks at developing functional requirements for the ratings of the converters, how big can the ratings be standardized, also for the grounding and layout. So you can imagine that if we want to have a DC grid expanding through the Europe, we should also standardize the grounding, which is not always the case for the same for all the vendors. Of course, the control modes, the dynamic performance of the HVDC stations, the exchange signal between the converter stations, startup and shutdown procedures, protection functions, and all control-related issues should be somehow coordinated and developed within functional requirements. At the end, functional requirement should limit discrepancies in the behavior of the power converter and should be technology agnostic in order to enable and to allow as many technology solutions as possible. Next slide, please. Beside the functional requirements, as I mentioned on the DC side, this task B will focus on the AC side on the grid forming capabilities. So this task focuses on the interoperability of grid forming converters, as mentioned, converters which could be sitting on the offshore side, but also on the onshore side, and is having 3 main objectives: to develop functional requirements under operation of hybrid AC/DC systems, and to develop, let's say, dynamic performance. Let's say tests and dynamic performance functions that we can test the grid forming capabilities. Next slide, please. Task C, as already mentioned in my introduction, is also the most important core of this workstream, which is performing the interaction studies. So this task investigates, as I mentioned, the solutions that will be provided by the vendors. So suppose we have a real project and vendors, any number of vendors, I would say, will develop control and protection cubicles, solutions, real solutions. This has to be tested. This has to be tested and it has to be assessed in order to demonstrate that they are risk-free. And of course, if there are any potential issues on these solutions developed, has to be corrected and has to be amended in this task. So upon the conclusion of task C, which is the interaction studies performed with hardware in the loop test setup, the task will provide recommendations whether the project can go or not to the construction phase, or of course it will limit any possible technical adverse interactions before it goes to the construction phase. Next slide, please. Last but not least is task D, so which is basically looking at the development of future DC connection code requirements. So all the experience that we will gain in Workstream 2 and Workstream 1 is linked, of course, to the standardization of the models, the interfaces, is linked to how to do the studies, is linked to develop experience on functional requirements. At the end, we have to collect everything and we have to develop requirements which could be recommended for the future to develop a so-called DC connection code, a DC connection code that will allow the gradual expansion of the DC grid through the years in an interoperable and in an interoperable way. As a matter of fact, this task is aiming to develop, let's say, the requirements of a future connection code, to provide recommendations, and of course to take into account all the relevant work which has been done so far from the standardization bodies like SENELEC and IC. And of course, they should be done in a way to ensure that they do not prevent any technology or topology. So summarizing everything, Workstream 2 is developing the functional requirements for the DC connection point, functional requirements for grid forming converters in a multi-vendor HVDC grid, is performing the interaction studies with the real control and protection cubicles from a real project that you will hear in a few minutes, and at the end is providing recommendations for future connection network codes which we need in Europe. Thank you all for the attention.
Thank you, Mario. And I see already in the chat many questions are coming up. So we are listing them, and for sure we will try to address them all during panel discussion. And meantime, I invite Pablo Brief to present the Workstream 3. Pablo represents General Electric Renewable Energy. Thank you, Pablo. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. This is the presentation of Workstream 3. Next slide, please. So this Workstream 3 is a core part of the technical innovation and development necessary to achieve interoperability. As was mentioned before, to achieve interoperability, we need to define standardized interfaces and functional requirements, and this will have an impact on the control and protection systems of the vendors. So in order to tackle this issue, the innovation is done most efficiently in a specific project environment. This approach, this project will cover all relevant steps of an infrastructure project, but the focus is on interoperability. Therefore, one of the main focus is alignment of functional specifications between TSOs and vendors, the development of interoperable solutions by vendors, both offline and hardware in the loop, testing for the newly developed control and protection systems. First, to study interoperable solution, but also to benchmark offline testing versus HIL, hardware in the loop testing, within the scope of the project, and finally to address the construction of the project. We believe this is the fastest way to achieve interoperability for an open market, and as opposed to conventional projects, in this project the results will be shared across all stakeholders within the EU. Next slide, please. So this Workstream is split into 7 tasks. The first task is task A, the shortlist of potential project definitions. So to define the potential projects and provide an overall understanding of the related HVDC multi-terminal system, there must be basic purposes and functions of the HVDC grid system, including all AC and DC converter stations. The shortlist may be based on technical aspects, but also on technical complexity and other feasibility aspects. The output of this task is a definition of potential projects, the topology diagram of HVDC multi-terminal systems, and a report on the shortlist of projects. Next slide, please. The next slide. Sorry. Go back, please, to task B. Thank you. Go up, please. Thanks. Another one. And one more. Thank you. Thanks. So in order to provide a first study, a pre-study of the control and protection system, this is done as a conceptual system design, as a work done between vendors and within the vendors, and of course with the inputs from TSOs, and this is based on a generic control and a generic function, and this is defined based on the standardization already defined in Workstream 1. This is done in an offline software in the loop simulation, and the output of this task is a pre-study report, where also we define a generic offline simulation model, the conceptual system designs, and a selection of a project out of the shortlist. Next one, please. Thanks. This slide, task C defines the drafting of detailed functional specifications. Here is where we increase the detail of the functional specifications towards a real case scenario, and this functional specification comprises grid forming controls among other specifications as well, and as well on the interface requirements and tests. So the outcome of this task is the detailed functional requirement specification and the functional test specification that vendors will then use to validate their control and development systems. Next slide, please. This is seen as the longest task. This is the control and protection development and system integration in a multi-vendor environment. So this task is mainly executed by vendors where they develop the control and protection systems, as well as they integrate the control and protection systems in a multi-vendor environment based on a real case scenario. For this purpose, the vendors deploy their control and protection systems in a hardware in the loop setup in a vendor independent facility, where an integrator will evaluate the results And this is to demonstrate the multi-terminal system that it complies with the functional specification already captured. It doesn't exhibit unwanted interoperability constraints or instabilities when connected to other HVDC converters, and it also complies with existing AC grid codes. At the end of this task, the control protection solution is demonstrated at technology readiness level 6, and the consensus report is issued by all parties. Next slide, please. After the hardware in the loop has been validated, we enter now a competitive bidding phase. So the goal of this task is to enter a competitive bidding, where the competitive bidding phase is the beginning of the commercial phase of a real industrial scale project. This will follow the framework already agreed in Workstream 5 and the procurement rules already agreed in Workstream 5 as well. The output of this task is a commercial offer to purchasers. Next one, please. This task is construction of a multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC system. This objective, of course, is to construct a real-scale industrial scale project where multi-vendor interoperability is demonstrated. And at the end of this task, the multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC installation will be in operation. There will be a lessons learned report on the functional specifications and other interoperability aspects of this work, and a project acceptance report and handover will be issued. Next one, please. And finally, after all the work has been commissioned and completed, the objective of this task is to refine the detailed functional specifications in view of future extensions of future projects. At the end of this task, the revised functional specifications are issued, and this project reaches the technology readiness level of 9. This concludes the presentation of Workstream 3, and I give the floor back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Pablo, very much for the presentation. This was one of the main and core work streams of all the program, so I hope you listened well. And now we will enter the next workstream presentation, Workstream 4, and which will be done together by Tobias and Simon. Please, Tobias and Simon, go ahead.
Thank you, Paulius. And as you can see, this is on collaboration and cooperation, so that's why me and Simon are two on this one. No, as mentioned, Simon and I will be introducing Workstream 4 to you. This workstream is dedicated towards enabling collaboration. So the collaboration needed to enable the other work streams, basically. It's already been mentioned several times, also in the beginning, that collaboration is you could say essential, but also in this space, you could say inherently challenging. So something really needs to be done, and we set up a complete work stream to facilitate this. Next slide, please. Luckily, this has also been mentioned several times. I won't go into detail, but basically, we come from a relatively simple world on the right, but with the illustration with more point-to-point and radial connections. And likely the future is going to look much more complex in terms of a lot of things, but particularly in terms of the number of stakeholders that needs to be involved in developing these large infrastructure projects. So to achieve all of this, you need to establish new ways of working together, and basically that's the background for Workstream 4. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay. So Workstream 4 will be a platform going across the entire activity, and the relevance will be to bring together stakeholders to find common ground, develop sensible and generic solutions to overcome barriers and concerns related to confidentiality, IP, data model sharing, but also interfaces in general. So the aim with Workstream 4 will be to learn from this work and develop a generic basis of collaboration frameworks, and thereby, you could say, enable cost reductions and risk reduction on future projects. Thank you for now. Over to you, Simon.
Yes, thank you, Tobias. And yeah, now it's my pleasure to provide you a slightly more detailed understanding of what this means in terms of the individual tasks. And if you have a look and start with task A, to account for the necessity to perform appropriate pre-studies and, for example, to develop a first conceptual system design, as mentioned in the last part by Pablo, a preliminary legal framework will have to be put in place in the early beginning to define the method of collaboration and also to ensure general information can be shared. And this includes, of course, exchange of generic models and technical parameters among all directly involved stakeholders like different TSOs, offshore developers, non-TSO asset owners, operators, integrators, and of course the vendors. And as an outcome, a preliminary contract document that covers the anticipated minimum requirements for the early stage are required to kickstart and ensure the smooth progress of the overall activities within this overall interoperability work stream. Yeah, fading over towards task B, the follow-up activity, the overall documents will have to be extended and refined towards a more generalized and universally applicable MV cooperation framework by clearly defining the different roles, the duties, and also the responsibilities of different parties. And consequently, this detailed framework will enable two aspects. First is detailed control and protection development with detailed models, but also dynamic system integration studies in some early planning stages with generic models. And two, this accounts for future expandability, which means we will also have a structure that provides access for additional parties joining projects at a later stage. And here to achieve the best possible and wide acceptance, the scope of these contract documents, where templates will also be made publicly available as deliverables for indirect and all other affiliated stakeholders. These will, of course, reflect connection requirements like the network code HVDC and further consider the developments related to DC connection requirements mentioned by Mario a couple of minutes ago. So next slide, please. And yeah, due to the first of its kind nature of this project, we foresee a governance board that will be initiated subsequent to the previous task B after the detailed contract documents are available to continuously evaluate and potentially also revise the multi-vendor cooperation framework, as well as provide some lessons learned seen from a commercial perspective for the outside world dealing with other or additional multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC projects. And in case changes are needed, this governance board will track their implementation and prove that everything is aligned to the view and the learnings in this task and in the whole project. And finally, there's a task D, which is a little beyond the previously described scope, and this activity will ensure the availability and deployment of appropriate simulation tools, as well as compilers and also interfaces. And in terms of interfaces, especially their implementation to tackle the increasing overall system complexity. And therefore, it will be necessary, also in close collaboration with software companies, to trigger the development on time of appropriate technical solutions to finally enable those large-scale EMT simulations of extensive hybrid AC and DC grid structures. And as a result, this task shall facilitate, of course, the tool development and further simplify the exchange and the processes related to EMT simulations among the different stakeholders to, in the end, implement future multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC projects. So in summary, related to Workstream 4, we can say the success of this workstream is very essential to work on the technical challenges that have been highlighted in the previous parts in Workstream 1 to 3 in a coordinated way. And as all important parties are finally gathered on one table, I think we can be pretty optimistic and move forward into the right direction. And yeah, now I'm happy to hand over back to Paulius and related to the last Workstream 5. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And we can enter to the last workstream. Will be presented by Philip, project engineer of offshore Amprion.
Yes, thank you very much. So we talked a lot about the technical aspects and also the cooperation framework, but in the end, since the overall goal is to establish a real industrial scale project, we also have to take into account all the network planning, project financing, and procurement aspects. So in the next few minutes, I will introduce the overall workstream a little bit and the general idea behind multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC networks, is that these will combine on the one hand offshore wind power plants, which are connected then to shore, and on the other hand, these will increase the interconnection capacities between different market areas. So in the end, we have two different tasks to cope here. So the first two steps of the work stream, these will focus on the development of a framework for network planning and financing of such a multi-terminal, multi-vendor, but also multi-purpose HVDC system. So we heard this in the beginning with the hybrid wind power plants and the hybrid projects. This is very important to take into account here. And in the second step, the work stream will cover all the different procurement processes and the baseline for the procurement process. So overall, after, let's say, around 5 years, all preparations have been finished so that the identified projects can enter the tender phase, and that we can start to also really bring this project to life. So if you can go to the next slide, the first one or the first task is about the further financing framework for planning. So here, since the founding scale of a real industrial scale HVDC project is relatively high, the task will derive a proper framework for then also hybrid assets and multi-terminal HVDC systems. So this is a kind of generic framework, and this will be applied to the short list of projects which is provided by Workstream 3, Task A, which you already heard before. And based on this, the budgets will be derived, and also the possible funding schemes will be analyzed. So based on this foundation, the task provides the initial project proposals, then also for targeted funding options. Next item, please. And the next part is about then, after having this funding baseline, the introduction of this project into the planning processes, so into the TYNDP process, and also having this project listed as a PCI project if a CEF funding is desired. And overall, which is very important here, is to respect that we on the one hand have European challenges, which are then reflected in the TYNDP, but also national challenges, which are more covered by the country-specific application procedures. So we have the interconnection, and we have the connection of wind to shore. And therefore, the CBA methodology, which is usually required for such an introduction to the TYNDP, this has to be an appropriate CBA methodology for such a hybrid project. And therefore, the appropriate methods have to be identified and then derived as a generic framework again and applied to our shortlist of projects. And based on the shortlist or the application of the method on the shortlist, then the final project can also be derived. You can go to the next slide. The second big part of the work stream is the development of a contractual basis and the procurement strategy. And therefore, one goal is to establish the basis for the tendering and the procurement procedure, including legal bases. And something which has to be taken into account here is, on the one hand, to ensure a proper competition, but also on the other hand, to have an optimized risk sharing between the different parties. And since the overall project as a multi-terminal, multi-vendor and multi-purpose project is relatively complex, it has to be taken into account that different components or different parts of the system have to be taken into account as different or as individual aspects. So, for example, an HVDC converter, HVDC cable, or maybe also an HVDC circuit breaker need to go into a separate tendering process. And based on this, the procurement strategy will be defined, and the preferred contractual setup will also be identified. At the moment, we think will be an EPCI or EPC, so an engineering, procurement, and construction contract based on international standards, but this has to be identified within the work stream. And last but not least, the procurement will be carried out by the corresponding TSOs or the non-TSO developer of such a system and has to follow all the EU directives and national regulations for sure. And this has to be also taken into account in the overall design. And last but not least, if you can click again, the last part is the implementation of the procurement strategy, and this is then the task of procurement and the creation of the related document. So this includes the tendering and the procurement process for all contracts of the main components, as already said. HVDC converters, HVDC switching stations and cables can be part of this. But also we have to take into account the different equipment which have to be used for the interaction studies. So these also have to be taken into account in the overall procurement strategy. So therefore, in this task, the functional specifications for all components will be developed, and this is for sure based on the findings of Workstream 1, 2, and Workstream 3. And finally, a very important part of the task of this task is as well the pre-qualification requirements. These also have to be identified and woven into the setup of the procurement strategy. And based on this, the procurement strategy can be executed. So that's based on a proper risk assessment and the proper risk sharing. Also, for example, the final investment decision can be carried out, and based on this final investment decision, then the overall project can enter the commercial phase. So overall, the entire project up to, or the entire process up to the commercial phase has been shown here, and from here it will then go to Workstream 3 again and will be carried out. So with this, I would like to hand over to Paulius again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philip, and thank you all of the presenters. So we had a brief overview of all the work streams. Of course, later on you will also receive a document itself, and it's already also available on the internet. Now we invite you to make a coffee break. Meantime, we will try to summarize and collect the questions on the chat. If you have any in parallel, please don't wait, and you can already post them, so we could use them during the panel discussion, which will start at 15:45. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the last part of our webinar. So this will be a panel session during the next 1 hour. We will. We will launch the discussion with a set of questions to our panelists to take first a helicopter view on what has been presented in the previous sections. But before I give the floor to our panelists for introducing themselves, I would like to invite all of you. I mean, I have seen that you have been already doing, but please take advantage of this discussion and do post your questions in the chat. Myself and Paulius will be reading the questions. We have already seen the previous ones, and we will try and addressing to the panelists, and we will try to cover as much as possible. Can you please move to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. Okay, I would like now to invite our panelists, Mark, Frank, Willem, and Troels, to please take 1 minute to introduce yourselves before we start with the discussion. Hello, Mark. Let's start with you.
Hello. Hi. Vasiliki. Hi, Paulus. And good afternoon, everybody. Wait, let me just turn off this background if I can. Of course, this looks very impressive, but I actually made sure I had a proper background so that I don't need it, because I also understood it. So this is not as impressive. This is just my living room. But I didn't think you were going to believe the other background anyway. And I heard it takes up a lot of bandwidth apparently, so I thought it's better to turn it off. Anyway, so right, just very briefly to introduce myself. So my name is Mark Verstiphout. I'm the deputy head of unit in the unit that is nowadays responsible for research, innovation, digitalization, and competitiveness. So as part of that, we coordinate DG Energy's input for the Horizon Europe work program, and we make sure that, let's say, the results out of the Horizon Europe work program or Horizon 2020 are fed back into policy discussions. So we try to make that link. That is, of course, an ongoing effort, and one of the tools we have for that is also the interaction through the SET plan, the Strategic Energy Technologies Plan. And this is a bit the framework within which we try to make sure that we organize our funding for research and innovation in line with the policy objectives of the DG and of the Commission. And I'm very happy to be here and enjoyed already the session so far. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. Let's move now to Frank, please. Could you give us 1 minute introduction?
Yes, welcome from my side. My name is Frank Schettler. I'm with Siemens Energy in Germany as a product manager for HVDC. And today in the meeting here, I'm representing T&D Europe. So I can only support what has been presented by the speakers before during this meeting in an excellent way, both on the background and also on the program that we are proposing here. And in the meeting, I will do my best to answer your questions from a manufacturer's perspective. And it would be nice if I could convince you a little bit more that what we are doing here is the right way to do, and looking forward to your questions. Thank you. Back to Vasiliki.
Thank you very much, Frank. Let's see. We will try to do our best to believe you. So let's now continue with Willem.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm here for ENTSO-E. So I'm also in the research and innovation section. So responsible for the secure operation of the system of tomorrow. And this is very much related to all HVDC issues. Yeah. And I think we developed in this part, this interoperability workstream together with the other important associations, WindEurope and T&D Europe. In my real life, I'm responsible for the electrical system design of the TenneT system in Germany, but also in the Netherlands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Willem. And I give the floor to you, Troels.
Yes, hello, and thank you, Vasiliki. Hello, everybody. My name is Troels Sørensen. I'm with Ørsted in Denmark, and today I'm representing WindEurope and Ørsted. Ørsted, as you may know, is a major offshore wind farm developer, and including in developing offshore wind farm is usually also developing and building and operating not only the wind farm but also the grid connection system. So we have a keen interest in the future development, obviously, of offshore wind, but also a future multi-terminal HVDC system to support the development of offshore wind in general, but certainly also to support Europe and the world in meeting the renewable energy targets that we have set. Thank you very much.
Thank you all panelists for the introduction. So to trigger the discussion, we already received over 20 or 30 questions that we listed, so be ready for this intensive speech. But already one of them was asking about a challenge in general. Is it realistic? Because with offshore energy strategy, we have very ambitious plans to install over 300 gigawatt of offshore plus additional offshore wind energy plus additional ocean energy. And HVDC technology is identify one of the key elements for it. So Mark, may I ask what are key enablers to make the industry ready for this challenge?
Yes, of course. Yes, thank you, Paulus. Good question. Of course, there are many things that are relevant for this, and many things that we are doing in terms of follow-up of the offshore renewable strategy. I think maybe from a more general point of view, and if I look at some of the big initiatives that we have undertaken since, it's of course the review of the 10E regulation. So that is currently being discussed in the Council and the Parliament and going in the good direction, and also with, let's say, the speed that it deserves considering the priority it has, where there is a lot of, let's say, more attention than before to offshore energy and offshore electricity or offshore energy infrastructure. So both in permitting as well as in making sure that member states make kind of integrated plans where they look at the different sea uses. And I think these things are very important in relation to getting these projects off the ground quickly. So I think this is one important thing. Now, of course, we're looking at the Fit for 55 package that is supposed to come out in a few weeks, where we will also review the renewable directive. That will look at many different things that also will benefit the offshore energy sector, and mostly on the generation side, of course. It is very much also in terms of creating demand. So there's not that much focus, let's say, on specific things to do for the offshore sector per se, but creating the general framework, creating a push for more renewables is definitely there. And then if I look at the let's say, what are we doing concretely to bring the technology forward and basically to support you with what you have been presenting just now? I think there are two very important things. One is the Horizon Europe work program, the one we just published the program for 2021 and 2022. So in there, we want to do two things. One is support the cooperation of the main organizations to design what a first demo should be. And of course, a lot of that is already happening, but to be able to continue that work, we are reserving 1 million in 2021 for that. And then in 2022, we want to support the development of a first big demo. And for that, we have reserved, if I'm not mistaken, 55 million euro, which is for Horizon Europe terms, a huge amount of money. I think until this came out, the record that I am aware of in the energy sector was very much linked to, was very much done with the promotion project, which was also big. But let's say support from Horizon Europe for a single project that will take HVDC further with a budget of or an EU contribution of 50 or 55 million euro. That is really huge. And so I think that's one important thing. So that is making this project happen. That is basically what this is about. And then the second thing that we're doing to make sure that one such a project is really embedded in a European approach to offshore energy, to offshore grids, to make sure that this contributes to a European standard and interoperability criteria, and that all the interested parties basically that have an interest in offshore grids in the future, but as maybe not as advanced as some are now, can also be involved. We have set up a dedicated working group under the SET plan to talk about HVDC, and that is also going very well, because it met for the last time, not for the last time, but it met, let's say, the last time it met was last week, and many of you were there, I think, and this was also a very good meeting to start defining what needs to happen in order to advance HVDC to a fully multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC to a fully market-ready technology that is that can be rolled out. And there's a good participation from many member states, and we're now working on an implementation plan that will also, I think, integrate many of the things that you are working on, but will enable to link this with the wider European context, and also make sure that other sea basins in the EU, when the time comes, can benefit from this work. So I think that's also very important for the longer term, and also, of course, to look at the general view on how these projects are funded, because what we fund with EU money has to benefit the whole of the EU.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I would like to follow up your statement about, you know, it's very important to identify what needs to be done, but also it's important to decide by when these things need to be done. So I would like to ask Willem. There has been also a question in the chat about this, so about the timeline of the work stream. So what has been presented as a roadmap, if it is in line to the European targets that Mark mentioned in his reply. Is this aligned? Should it be accelerated? What is your view on this?
Yeah, well, so I think this is an important task what we have in front of us. Yeah? So with the 300 gigawatt, which were mentioned already as the early beginning of this workshop, with 300 gigawatt offshore by 2050, yeah, and the transmission infrastructure will play an important role, yeah, to achieve this objective. Yeah? And HVDC system with their power flow control capability will be a key technology, I'm sure. Yeah. In the first stage, the multi-terminal system itself, with the increased market coupling, reduced societal costs, but also with higher RES integration capacity. That's why we are all here. Also, WindEurope is very much interested to bring this forward. Yeah? And then in the second stage, the multi-vendor systems, yeah, with the limitations of the risks, yeah, related to one single technology provider, and to have more and increased competition. Yeah? So this is really important, and many grid infrastructure HVDC projects are already in planning today. So how to ensure interoperability from the specification stage, how to pave the way for multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC projects, and how to expand multi-terminal, multi-vendor HVDC grids across countries. So this all starts on individual project solutions, yeah, which will come together to larger DC grids. Yeah. So without having the capability for an extendable HVDC system under competitive market conditions, will definitely be a risk for the project itself. On the one hand, and at least it will have a huge impact on, let's say, the energy transition. So from my point of view, and what we discussed also among TSOs, it's really important to start as soon as possible So because the first projects are already under the development, or let's say under the planning development, and the specification of such things is really important, and how to cope with that. Yeah, if we on the one side specify something, nobody can have, let's say, on this tender and can have an answer on this tender. Yeah, that's really a risk. So from our point of view, we have to start as soon as possible.
Thank you, William. And I would shift this discussion towards Frank now. And Frank, HVDC technology is well developed, and there are many applications point-to-point on transmission systems so far, and as William already mentioned. And there was also the question, do we have multi-terminal HVDC grids or systems in Europe? And what is the different challenge here? So what would be?
Yeah, thank you for this question. I think in one word, what we need is innovation, and I would say there are different types of innovation that we look at here. We have a lot of discussions ongoing in the field of certain equipment and solutions. So we talk about DC circuit breakers, we talk about DC-DC converters, we may talk about load flow controllers, all of these things that will come up when we are planning HVDC grids or HVDC systems of the future. But there's one essential part of innovation which can be considered the enabler of all of the other things that were just mentioned. And this is basically the purpose of this meeting today, and it has been mentioned very often. This is about interoperability of multi-vendor systems. So now I've seen it in the chat, and I think it's quite clear. If you look at HVDC today, there are vendors that definitely know how to build HVDC, and yeah, maybe there are even already projects that have been built with contributions from different vendors. But what we are considering now is a new type of quality here in HVDC systems, because now we envisage systems that are that can be expanded step by step. So you start with a defined system at the beginning with 3 stations, with 2 stations maybe, and you want to have the freedom to extend it in the future and build more systems, extend it, build HVDC grids. And this is a big shift for all the HVDC technology, because if we look at HVDC today, then they are designed as an integrated system. They are designed to connect AC terminals, and most of the requirements are defined at the AC terminals. And everything in between these AC terminals is in the hands of a single vendor in the most cases. And I can assure you there are many functions in an HVDC system that make an HVDC system work that are not visible on the outside. So they are not directly appearing on the AC terminals. They are needed to organize the systems and make them operable. And that's why today we consider HVDC as an integrated system. And now imagine that you want to build such systems out of the contribution from different vendors. So you want a converter station provided by vendor A and a converter station by vendor B. Then you have to dive deep into these integrated functions, and you have to understand what is the function that belongs to a station, what is the function that needs to be interfaced to another station or maybe to an HVDC grid controller. And this is the challenge that we have in front of us here. And from a T&D Europe's perspective, and we are happy that the entire consortium shares this point of view. And this can be done in the best way when we take a real project and we dive into the needs of this project, and we identify the functions that are needed. And define the interfaces between the individual deliverables and define functional requirements for these interfaces. And this is what it's all about. And I think this is a big step of innovation. It's not the one that brings us new types of equipment, but it will bring us a huge step forward towards HVDC grids and towards reaching our goals, connecting huge amounts of offshore wind to the onshore systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. I would like to continue with a question to you, because it is linked to what you just mentioned. So and there have been many statements in the chat regarding this. So why we also the presenters before highlighted the importance of having, for this R&D, of having a full-scale demonstrator of how these technologies can be interoperable. Could you please comment why we need this full-scale demonstrator, and why wouldn't we be able to manage this and resolve this with maybe some lab testing, or wouldn't be faster or maybe less risky? Or
I think the situation that I have described before directly points to the challenges that we have here. So we have to dive very deeply into the technology. And this is out of experience. Yes, one can do this. We can do this on a blank sheet of paper and start doing everything. But we will end up with many, many options that do not lead us to the core questions that we have to resolve. And this is about identifying these core functions that need to be organized in an HVDC grid. And what we are proposing here in this interoperability program is to take one project, take it as a starting point. It will just be a kickoff for the entire process, and identify these core functions, and then go through the entire procedure of realizing a real project. And we, as the manufacturers, we cannot do this alone. This is quite obvious. But we definitely need the TSOs and the ones who are responsible for the for maintaining system stability, for securing the energy supply. And I think a real project setup will give an excellent framework for doing this. And at the end, I think we have to speed up. It was said by Wilhelm before, we have to be fast. So there's no time to lose. Let's take a real project. Let's dive into it. Let's develop specifications, because at the moment we are not in a position to build systems like that without having such a specification. And then go through the entire project step by step and make it happen. And at the end, we will have a starting point for future standardization in the world of IEC or at Senelec. And we will do, at the end, we will establish a completely new market for HVDC technology. That's what I'm convinced of.
Thank you, Frank. We will still continue on this topic of the project itself at the moment, because there was many questions asked, and there was one recently posted. So continuing on this, I will ask Rose, why do we go in this workstream for high voltage project, full-scale demonstrator, instead of lowering the risk and starting with medium voltage? What are the differences?
That's a good question. I think, first of all, medium voltage DC, if that's what you're thinking of, is not really that relevant today for large-scale offshore wind. We are beyond that, you can say. The cost-optimal offshore wind farms are sized around 1 gigawatt today. So that necessitates high-voltage DC as a starting point. You can say medium voltage DC is maybe more relevant for onshore applications in the first step, to my mind. Maybe in the future it can be relevant for array cable systems in offshore, but I don't see that as the natural and necessary next step. That would clearly have to be HVDC, just in order to get to the transmission capacity necessary to support the development of offshore wind.
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Then maybe I could also ask for William to add what are the interoperability differences of full-scale demonstrator, for instance, and if we do just in lab environment.
Yes, I think this is really important. The first important thing is that a lockstep for ongoing projects has to be avoided. Yeah, that's important. Yeah. As the projects are developing further, the activity on HVDC interoperability has to start immediately. That's clear. But I also think we can incorporate this question about, let's say, generic models, yeah, in a lab configuration, yeah, what was also mentioned. And I think the aim here behind is not to do a lot of paperwork. Yeah, so it's an implementation project, and it's in addition an industrial implementation project. That means, yeah, that we have to be in order to solve this, have to be very close to real projects, because it should work, yeah, immediately in the project. It should be used for the project, for the first project, and then to be used for all further projects. Yeah, this is this idea to have this capability on board. Yeah, without having this capability on board, we have a very high risk. Yeah, so to have maybe then non-sustainable grid solutions for such an important task with the 300 gigawatt. Yeah, so that's really important to have the redundancy, the topological redundancy, the flexibility, the public acceptance, everything. Yeah, so and this we can only achieve if we can ensure that this demonstration runs in a real project in the final step. Of course, you have to do some lab configuration in advance. Yeah, that's clear. It's not possible to go directly to offshore, yeah, and to put it on a platform. But the good news are the HVDC, as Frank said, the HVDC technology itself has a very high TRL level already. Yeah, so it's TRL 9, whatever. So we can easily bring it in, but first we have to do it in a lab configuration, of course, but then very close to, let's say, to the real developments. Yeah, we all don't know because under intellectual property and it's integrated, but of course we have to do it in a lab configuration as a full industrial multi-vendor control and protection system, not an, let's say, generic one, because it's not the idea to have now, let's say, requirements on that. Yeah, so the idea is to have, let's say, a description on that, yeah, which can be used by all others, yeah, in order to bring this idea of a multi-vendor solution forward.
So actually, it is a technical matter, but with many other parameters that can only be tackled in a real environment, and it's actually a matter of time, right? Is the only way to go faster. I wanted to ask Trolls now. So from the perspective of a major offshore wind developer, why is HVDC interoperability so important? Are you facing problems today due to the lack of HVDC interoperability?
I think we have already seen issues with lack of interoperability since about 10 years. We saw the first examples of power electronics converter connected systems that didn't operate well with other similar systems in the same networks. So I think that we can clearly say that this is not a hypothetical or theoretical issue. It's a very real issue that has to be addressed already today in our projects, and we look at interoperability and stability in all of our projects. Connecting to HVDC is also something that we have experience with from our projects in northern Germany. It's clearly also something that has to be looked at and confirmed in each of those projects. So going forward with even more HVDC connected systems and interconnected HVDC systems, there will just be more and more power electronics interfaced systems. And we really need methods, procedures, and standards that can give us certainty up front that we can achieve interoperability, that we can achieve stability is quite critical as far as we see it.
Thank you, Drow. Maybe I will shift a little bit to now a higher level of discussion to Mark. There was a lot of discussion. I see many comments on the chat about that this is not a new challenge. This was, I saw example that Brazil did the project of multi-vendor. So my question also about location. Some mentioned already existing clicks which could be extendable. So my question is, what would be the role in general, agreeing with all the stakeholders where to place the project and what kind of functionalities should be new side project or existing extension of that. So how this process could look like with all that stakeholders agreeing on it.
You asking me, Paulus?
Yes.
Well, I mean, that is, I'm not sure if we have a predefined view on that. I think I mean, from our point of view, it's clear that we need such a, let's say, we need this technology and we need to make concrete steps to get it done. And either or even with some of the things that we've been doing before, like promotion, we're not there yet. And so I think we need to take steps. And yeah, I think that, you know, it's difficult for me to say how exactly it should look like. I would like to think that's not also necessarily our role to define that. What I think is important for us is that this is something that is on the one hand for the benefit of the energy system and the main actors in it. So the let's say the network operators and the offshore wind developers. On the other hand, promotes the competitiveness of the EU industry in this area. So making sure that it also sets a European approach to how such a grid can be built. And because I think I don't know about Brazil, to be honest, but you know, the examples of China have been mentioned before, but the approach there, of course, is very, very different. And I think in Europe we will not have one offshore TSO, and we will not have one big EU company that will provide all the technology. So we want to do this in a market where TSOs cooperate across national borders, but you know, also maintain their national responsibilities and, you know, cooperate more and more intensively. I think there are many things also there that we can promote, like we do with the offshore renewable energy strategy, and make sure that let's say the technologies that we need for such an HVDC grid, also beyond what we're discussing today, are developed by thriving companies that can compete on a global scale, and that develop things that are also that show that they can work, that show that they can work in a system that is not, let's say, one integrated system being sold, because we think that also benefits the business of those companies on a global scale, in particular if we look at all the ambition for offshore wind across the world. So I think this is let's say the cooperation that we're seeing here is, we think, also an added value for the European industry when we show our global leadership in offshore wind. Because it's not just about building the wind parks, it's also about getting the energy to land. And I think there we are also front runners.
Thank you very much, Mark. Indeed, very clear. There has been a question in the chat about the objective, the scope of the work stream. So this is, I think, is a question for Willem again. So the objective of the work stream seems to be much more on functional requirements for normal operation, but there is not much discussion about major failure situations or extreme situations. Is there such an objective that maybe was not very clear in the presentations, or so it's?
Well, I think this was maybe not that clear because the presentation for each of the work package was just 5 minutes. So, but it's obvious that this is a must, to have it included. So so work package 1 and work package 2 deals very much with interactions. And interactions does not mean normal operation. Interactions means, of course, that there are incidents, unplanned incidents, failure behavior, so at the DC side, but also at the AC side. So it's really important to have this in mind, that it's not, let's say, a load flow calculation here or a normal operation situation. So of course, all, let's say, extreme situations we know should also be covered here. And let's say such a system should survive, and such a system should be, let's say, interoperable. And that's where we're aiming on now.
Thank you, William. And with the next question, then I would like starting to go deeper about some functionality, standardization, and etc. And Frank, this one will go to you. There was a question on the chat in general, how to ensure that this kind of project, because it will be first of a kind and probably with support of European Union, how to ensure that this project does not give just a benefit for a few suppliers or one supplier, but sets a level playing field and benefit for all technology developers later on to extend towards it. Frank, you're muted.
Thank you very much. Well, I think the entire project is set up to develop functional requirements. And in this sense, so we define what shall happen at the interfaces at various conditions. And I can only add to what William has just said. This includes everything. So we have to define the right requirements for the interfaces so that we cover all operating aspects, including faults. I think doing this, we will at first define these interfaces, and we will gain first experience in the first project, whoever will contribute to this project. I'm, as a vendor, will not be the one who decides who will contribute to it. It's important from a vendor's perspective that we really attack all the interface requirements, and that we prove that the HVDC systems can be built based on the requirements that are defined and that are specified. And based on that, the program foresees a lot of dissemination events. So we will publish all the results. They will go into the standardization. They will continue the work that is already ongoing at IEC. For instance, in the field of guidelines to functional specifications, a working group that I am convening. So I think this is all. There's a lot already done on the technical side to lay the ground for all of this, and we have to go one step further. We have to bring it to a real project, and we will continue from there, of course, because there will be future projects with slightly different requirements. So as I said at the beginning, this, from my perspective, looks like the beginning of an entirely new market, and we just have to find a starting point. So there will be no limitation whatsoever for new vendors to come up, even in new fields that we do not see today. I'm thinking of integrators on the DC circuit. So just we have to do the first step, I think.
Thank you very much, Frank. So as a comment to what you say and also to what Mark said before, and of course there is this great opportunity of the working group HVDC that was just set up by the European Commission, and all these outcomes, all these discussions can take place there. So I wanted to ask you, Mark, how so this work that was presented, how I mean, you're here, so I suppose you find it useful, but how do you think it can be practically used for the future discussions in the working group HVDC, for example? Because it requires also wide acceptance, right?
Yeah.
As a document.
Yeah. Well, I mean, useful, I have no doubt. I would actually say, you know, this is the core of what of the work that group will do. I think I'm also not so worried about the expertise and the engagement we have in the group, because I think that let's say the expertise is great. The commitment of the people in there. I mean, everybody is there because they see a benefit, I think, and so it's you know, it's our joint responsibility to make sure that we maintain that this group has an added value, and that will of course be linked to feeding or making this group as the basis for experts to connect and to link the, let's say, individual projects together and make sure that there is a learning between them and also an endorsement. Let's say what I am a bit worried about is more those who are not in the group. So the ones that do not have any, I mean, we set up this group, it's open for everybody in the EU, basically, who is a stakeholder or a member state, university, research institute, companies, through the associations. But I think it's what is most important, or where I'm worried, is that the, let's say, people who are not there because they have not really given this a priority, but in 3 or 5 years it will become an issue, and because maybe they don't have necessarily the expertise at the moment. And I think this is something where pan-European associations like ENTSO-E, T&D Europe, and also WindEurope can play an important role. I think we have to play a role by making sure that in the SEPLAN steering group, where all the member states are, we also continuously emphasize or show what the work is of this group. But I can imagine that at some point we also need to look at how do we actively bring other network operators, for example, up to the point that they know what is, that they have the expertise that is needed for this type of work, which are kind of like twinning projects or those kind of things. And I think this sometimes links, of course, the research is always driven by the ones who know most about it. That's by definition. And we want to push this further and we want to go fast. But I think we need to pay continuously attention to see how we can bring as much as of the other people along, realizing also that's their own responsibility. But I see also a responsibility for us in the Commission to make an active effort to make that happen.
So you mean also other countries that are maybe not so much, they are not so much advanced maybe with offshore wind development, and maybe for this reason, this is what you mean. Okay, thank you. Sorry, Paulus.
Thank you. Thank you, Vasiliki. Maybe continuing on what Mark said, and there was also a question in the chat, so which will go to William, I think the most. William, there was a question, and as Mark said, we need to bring TSOs onto this, and how to ensure that this is acceptable by many of TSOs, not only the ones who are participating in the project.
So first of all, we are talking about the interoperability workstream. Yeah, interoperability workstream is, let's say, a product of all European TSOs. Yeah, full stop. So it's fully aligned with that this is the way we have to go ahead. Yeah, it's fully aligned on the timeline. Yeah, so how we can go ahead, and it's also aligned on the task itself. Yeah. And there was another question I would also to raise or highlight here a bit, yeah, which was raised. So this is about the 9 years plan, yeah, because it seems to be very long. Yeah. On the other side, you have maybe you have to consider that, let's say, for the projects itself, there is already a lot of ongoing work before tendering. Yeah. And so the most important step is to have, let's say, the refinement of detailed function specifications aligned, yeah, here in this work stream together with vendors, yeah, that this is realistic, that to be specified in this direction, yeah. And this is already, let's say, available, so under our plan within the first 2 years, yeah. And this would fit very much, yeah, to bring, let's say, the new generation of projects which are coming up into a position to cope with their challenges. Yeah? So otherwise they cannot cope with those challenges. So as this entire work stream is completely aligned, yeah, with all European TSOs, and it will be published, I think, after this workshop today. So I have no doubt that it is completely covered also. It completely covers all the challenges all TSOs in Europe sees here. And from that perspective, I think from the TSO side, this is not a big issue. So if it comes to a project, whatever this will be a project, yeah, will be. So there is some funding available, which will be there in 2022. Maybe there is also need to go a bit earlier than without funding. Nobody knows. But even if there is a group of, let's say, TSOs develop this further, yeah, because this is in their interest, yeah, to make the project, let's say, fit for these challenges. Of course, this has to be very much aligned, and it will be aligned with all TSOs, but also with others, yeah, which are here in this group, yeah. So with the vendors and also with, let's say, the wind industry, it's important that we go step by step ahead together.
Thank you very much, Willem. So continuing the comment you just made, I would like to ask a question to Trolls. We talked already very much about the importance of standardizing, of creating the regulation and standardizing these requirements, and it's quite obvious to everyone, I think, why it's so urgent and helpful for the TSOs and for the vendors. But I would like to hear some arguments why it is important also for the wind industry, both. Okay, for developers, but I think it's the case also for the technology suppliers, wind turbine manufacturers.
Yeah, as I touched on before, the industry and also Ørsted has already seen issues with the interoperability since maybe 10 years ago. And it is part of developing new offshore wind farms and grid connection systems for offshore wind farms to do some level of interoperability studies. Such studies rely on the information available, both information and models from wind turbine suppliers. It also relies on methodologies, how to aggregate and represent a lot of wind turbines into aggregate wind farms. But at the other end of the grid connection system, there's also a need to represent the public grid. Say a need to represent embedded generators. There's a need to represent existing HVDC systems. So you can see there's a lot of information and models and data that needs to be exchanged in order for the industry to be able to develop a new system. So we strongly believe that this project can help clarify what information needs to be exchanged in which form, and how can the exchange of information be done in a structured and validated manner, so that we have a level playing field for all engaged in this industry, both wind turbine suppliers, offshore wind farm developers and builders of grid connection systems, and certainly also for TSOs involved. It is a risk and it is a problem that we don't have transparency with regards to the information. And it is a problem for the industry that we don't have a way of securing the necessary information about existing systems, so that new systems can perform the right analysis at the right time to ensure stability and interoperability, to stay with those words. For a commercial developer, it's something that translates into uncertainty and risk, and the economics involved if we are facing delays because of instability that cannot be mitigated upfront and has to be mitigated when we start wanting to produce. That's a lot of money at stake, to be frank about it. So there's a number of really significant issues that we see that this project can help mitigate.
Thank you, Trolls. And you brought very well discussed topic. It was quite a lot of comments before that, so I will try to summarize them and give to Frank to answer. for the interfaces and information exchange, because indeed there was a comment actually which was said opposite, saying that information exchange and interfaces are not that important. Is more important is to make testing strategies clear. Could you comment on this?
Well, I would say, yeah, definitely we need a testing strategy, but the question I would have here, also answering this question, is what should we test? So what is the functionality that should be tested? And once we have that, the next step will definitely be to identify a valid and trustful test strategy. And well, I can only repeat that the first step should be to come to the functional requirements, and then we will see how these functions at the interfaces need to be tested, how compliance to the requirements can be tested, and this will bring up the question about a proper test strategy. And this will include not only hardware testing, of course. So I think in the first step, I would say hardware will play an important role, because we probably have to develop new interfaces. We have to change our hardware probably to make these interfaces accessible. So there's some development needed here, and this will definitely require in the first step some hardware in the loop testing. But I would expect as all of these testing procedures and the hardware and the models, as they mature, software in the loop will become more and more interesting and also more and more economic to do. So we will start an entire process of innovation here if we do the first step. And this is another example for that.
Paulius, if I could add something to that, is it possible? So, because in the workstream, I think this is not in contradiction, because in the workstream, in the different workstreams, we are also working, let's say, on test strategies, yeah. And even if you do test strategies, yeah, on not randomly, but to have it, let's say, ready for the future that you can use it, yeah. For example, for interaction studies, yeah. So how to do it in real, yeah. The interaction studies, for example, you need a test strategy, but this is also standard in the future developments, because if you have a good idea and you can justify what should be tested, huh, then it's also kind of standard.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Willem. And maybe next to this information testing of software in the loop, hardware in the loop, how will we plan to manage IP rights? And how to ensure that this kind of discussion about vendors' IP rights are not taking too long and project can move fast enough?
Whom is this question going to?
Frank, to you.
Well, I would say this is another interesting moment here to say we can gain some speed here in the environment of a real project. Yes, I'm aware that we have some challenges here, but I think we also have already found a good way dealing with this, and I think the starting point of all of discussions should strictly be, what is the minimum requirement? What do we want to see? What do we have to study? What information needs to be exchanged and why? And out of that, we will derive what does it take to make that happen, to exchange this information. And if we do this in a strictly functional way, then I'm absolutely sure that we also find solutions for all the interface requirements that may come up. And just to mention this, I think we already have made quite some good experiences with the functional approach. So when we started work at Senelec about 8 years ago now, working on guidelines for functional specifications, there was a big question in the room. How do you want to deal with intellectual property and all of these kinds? And I think we have demonstrated here quite clearly that going with the functional way, going from the functional requirements and having an understanding of the physical principles that we want to cover, that we can find good solutions and good descriptions for all of that. And I'm really trustful that we can also make this here.
Thank you, Frank. There have been also some comments in the chat about grid forming, right? And in the report we also talk about this. There are some objectives. Maybe this is a question to Willem. So, what is already included, and what do you think should be the next step, maybe with regard to this?
So I think grid forming control is really important there instead of grid following control. Yeah, if you would like to develop, let's say, a carbon-free system which is dominated definitely by power electronics, not only on the transmission side but also on the generation side. We see it already in the distribution system, in the offshore systems. Everything is dominated by power electronics, and maybe also the demand will be dominated in future by power electronics, to have a better control of the demand, maybe also in the medium voltage, whatever it would be. So there are a lot of activities, but the focus of this project is not to develop grid forming control further, but grid forming control can also not, as a control concept, can also not be ignored when creating this interface, when creating and testing, let's say, the control and protection system, the industrial control and protection system, multi-vendor, multi-terminal solutions, because grid forming control is part of this. So in principle, I don't think there is a way not to have this capability. If it is used or not, this is an operational question, but to have this capability on board. And if this capability is on board, we have to ensure that this will work together with our concepts, and so we cannot ignore it.
This is another reason why, as a wind sector, is very important for us to be, since the very beginning of the discussions, part of the discussion. So I would like to ask also trolls to comment on this. Maybe what role you see trolls for wind farm operators in this discussion. You're muted.
Sorry, the role that we have taken in this project, and as you know, has been to be part of the coordination effort in this project. And this is basically because we feel that we can contribute the most by facilitating or contributing to facilitating the agreements between the parties, something that we have experience with in our own projects, obviously. But we are very much aware of the need to establish a framework of templates for agreements, etc., to be able to effectively handle the exchange of information in the projects, the development of standard contract basis for handling projects. We see that as a key element of being able to handle this in an efficient way. I'm a little bit conscious about the focus on the first demonstrator project. I think that is actually a huge benefit for this project, that it's focused on a specific demonstrator project. It makes things very focused, which is a very good thing. But I think we should also need to be conscious about the importance of the next projects or the parallel projects that are potentially even going to connect to this first demonstrator projects. So the spin-off from the early years in this project, I think year 2 was mentioned just before, the spin-off of templates, standard agreements is something that we see as a huge benefit for the industry all along this specific project.
Thank you, Troll. And we have many questions which are still unanswered in the chat, but we don't have also time to go through all of them. So then I will invite the speakers now go also around the table and to wrap up. And I would like to start with Frank. to make your most takeaways and maybe what are your next thoughts or next steps you think in the T&D Europe and T&D Europe members will do now?
Yeah, first of all, I would like to say thank you very much for these very interesting discussions. And I think this is important to also have support from the European community on everything that we are doing here. And I think it's fair to say that the HVDC industry will play an important role in this process, but it's very clear at the same time that the industry cannot do this alone. And this means we have to team up with TSOs, and we have to team up with offshore wind, because we are talking about making connection for renewable energy. So that's good to form a team like this. And I really appreciate the opportunity to have this consortium here who have come together to find a way and to propose a way forward, how to use all this renewable potential that we have. So we have done a lot already on the technical side. We are on a good way, but I think it's also it has also become clear to me here that it's not only a technical topic. We also have to address the entire framework. That's very clear. We have to set the framework for a project with the different contributors, finding the way to deal with IP and all of these things. And yes, I'm quite confident that we can achieve that. And I can only assure you that the industry, the HVDC industry represented by T&D Europe, is fully supporting this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Frank. And now William from TSO side.
Yeah. I think the first point is thanks, Mark, for that initiative. Yeah, and it's important, to actively support the Commission and the initiatives on these HVDC issues in the set plan on the technical working group. So to bring this together and also to integrate this idea here. Mark, you said already this is one of the main tasks of this group, and I think I definitely agree to that. We should bring this together further, that we have a clear plan also in the set plan, what to do and how to integrate that. But on the other side, we have also closely to go along together with, let's say, all the relevant stakeholders, mainly as we are talking about high voltage, extra high voltage, very high voltage, 525 kV. With the relevant players here, on this important task, keeping in mind the given timeline and not waiting very long, but to start immediately, just to ensure that the next project generation, which is also within TenneT, let's say already on the starting point, to equip this, with first ideas, to have functional specifications or functional requirements for specifications, which will be also accepted by a larger group of vendors, that they can cope with that, and that we can achieve already in the next 1-2 years. And if we wait the next 1-2 years, I think then this time we lose this time. So that's the most important thing. And when I wrap up what I received today, so all the others have the same view, and I'm happy that I'm sure that we will go along that and we will achieve it in the time, and we can have a carbon-free system as soon as possible in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Indeed, this cooperation is a key for interoperability. Trost, from your side, what are your main takeaways?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think I've stressed a few times the importance that we put on equal access, transparency in requirements. This is key for a wind developer to be able to predict what will be the conditions for connecting offshore wind farms. In our case, as is also the case for other major developers, we are also developing grid connection systems that makes it even more important to have this transparency and equal access to information, equal access to data sharing that come out of this project. So we put great importance on this work, mainly to pave the way for the huge expansion of, let's say, up to 250 gigawatts in the North Sea area. We think this project is key to achieve that.
Thank you. And Mark, this is leave you from all the panelists to make the final word of a panel discussion. So please go ahead and give us this European perspective.
All right, good, thanks. No, also from my side, of course, thank you for having me. Thanks for the other panelists and to you, Vasiliki and Paulus, for the good moderation. And I'm also encouraged by all the discussion in the chat, because I think we really have a topic here where there's a lot of interest and a lot of a lot of people who want to contribute to drive this, well, to solve this issue. Let's put it like that. And of course, this is not going to be easy. It was never easy, but I'm very confident. Also, if I see how this discussion goes, the huge turnout for today's webinar, that if we put our minds together on this, then we will make it happen. And I think that really gives me a lot of confidence that we are able to bring this further. And I think it's clear what I also said at the beginning. What we are discussing here is an essential element of the offshore renewable energy ambitions of the EU, and therefore of the Green Deal. Because the offshore part is a key part of the Green Deal. Without us developing the offshore energy potential of the EU, we will not achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. So I think this this is really very, very important. Here we're discussing how can we bring the concrete technology issues further. Tulsi also mentioned, let's look at what comes after. I think there are maybe two things that I still wanted to mention that, of course, also important as a further follow-up, and one is the work that our colleagues who take care of the internal market are doing. For example, looking at the review of the network codes together also with ENTSO-E, obviously, and everybody else, how we can incorporate there the integration of HVDC, in particular in the offshore grid. And secondly, of course, going from basically research demonstration, bigger demonstration into projects of common European interest that can also help then driving the rollout of the offshore grid. So I think in that sense, the path is the instruments are lined up to scale this up. So from our point of view, first of all, I would like to express my gratitude for the great work that you've been doing. I would like to express my gratitude also to my colleague Mario, who is maybe not talking so much in meetings like this, like myself, but as you all know, is the one who makes this happen within the Commission. And so I think I wanted to also thank him. And I just hope we can keep this engagement going and keep this discussion going. And we are here to support you. So when we can help, let us know. I will not say that we can just, whatever you want us to do, it can happen like that. But you can count on us to put our best effort and engagement into to help you make this happen. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Mark. Indeed, I think this kind of support, it's very feelable from European Commission side. And I remember the whole work in general, it was initiated in 2019 in February when we had all this workshop during your Commission initiated workshop on HVDC, and this interoperability was identified one of the challenges which needs to be solved. And then three associations pick up on it and came up with this proposal. And it's three associations proposal. But we discussed that we need to put indeed our minds together. This is the challenge to be solved for all European Green Deal. So what is next that we will discuss this with more wide event, not public, let's say, technical working group HVDC, which is already several times mentioned in the set plan. We shared with our proposal from 3 associations with them, and we hope this will be a good building block to agree even with wider group of different people. And this will lead us, and this is with ENTSO-E, T&D Europe, WindEurope are strongly stating that we need to go for real, full industrial, full-scale HVDC multi-terminal, multi-vendor project. So read more about it. The document is already online. I also paste on the chat the link to access it, who have not yet found it. And I would like to thank especially for all the participants and all the people who placed their questions on the chat. Sorry, we were not able to answer them all due to time limits, but we really appreciate your interest, and we are really looking forward for this cooperation together with you. Thank you very much, and we would like to close the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.